So today, I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story. And this story is going to braid in some of the themes of the Torah portion. It's going to be a story that talks about wandering and exploring, of being lost and being found. The themes of the collective and the individual, the human dance of polarities, that beautiful tension in which we all exist but very few of us like to acknowledge. Themes of looking for God and finding revelation in unexpected places. Themes of resilience, restoration, of rest and renewal. Before I get into this story, I want to acknowledge that I stand on the shoulders of many who came before us, and we have one in our midst right now, Paula Park, one of the original OGs, as we like to say, when it comes to people within the Jewish community who are also part of our rainbow family, wanting to acknowledge space and place, and having conversations of the fact that we deserve to be part of the ritual life as well as the familial life, not because of anything we do, but simply because of who we are. So I want to thank Paula. I think of Arthur Blankstein. I think of many who laid those foundations. There is a saying, it takes a grain of rice to tip the scale. And we never know what that grain of rice will be, or who it will be. But every other grain had to be there first. So none of our actions, our conversations, are done in isolation. So of course I have to do this with a bit of smattering of humor because that's who I am. I'm going to be on time-ish, approximately 10 minutes. And there's going to be some musings of my own journey because I like to speak from my own experience. And also braiding in the ancestral wisdom of the generations of our families. Our families of blood, our families of kinship, and our families of choice. If I do tell a joke and you don't laugh because of my accent or whatnot, I'm going to prompt you with a cue. It will look like this. Good, you're laughing. That's awesome. Thank you all very much. I still need some validation every now and then, so that will be very helpful. Thank you. So I was born as a young child. Well, you only got it there. The youngest of a large brood of boys in a fairly affluent Roman Catholic family that was roiling amongst post-Vatican II changes in a majority Roman Catholic state in the country of Australia. Brief history of colonization in Australia. When the Europeans arrived, the churches informally decided to divide up the country by state. Each Christian denomination got a state that was kind of theirs. So the Anglicans, Church of England, got New South Wales because they were there first, and then they got Victoria, but they had to share Victoria with some of the Baptists and the Methodists and the Presbyterians, but not all the Baptists because they were kind of annoying. So they were pushed down into South Australia. The Catholics got Queensland, God's country, and that's where I was born. The Salvation Army got South Australia and the Northern Territories and Western Australia because honestly no one else wanted them at the time. But once they realized there was stuff there, all the churches moved around. Now, it wasn't saying that the churches were not present, but there was a majority presence in every state. I was born in Queensland, and I was born into a Roman Catholic family in a Roman Catholic state. And I was also born in a time where the White Australia policy was still in full force, which meant that the only types of people we allowed to immigrate to our country were either white or could be read as white or passed as white. That was a practice in law until 1973, and it was in practice until the late 80s. So I grew up with the idea of diversity. I grew up with ecumenicalism, but our idea of interfaith conversations was what type of Christian were you? Or what type of white were you? Where did you come from? But in that whole system of change, I understood that there was a lot more going on. I felt a deep connection to Spirit and to Creator from a very early age. I was an altar boy by choice. I wasn't forced into it. I loved the church. I loved the ritual, the smells, the bells, the whole thing. I was into it. And at the age of 10, I felt a deep connection and a calling, a determination to find out who I was. In order to find out who I was, I needed to find out who God was. So I decided to find God at 10. I thought most kids did this at 10 till I became a parent. And then I realized I was a very odd child. 48 years later, I am still on that journey. I have a bit more insight under my belt. I have a fair stronger sense of who I am and to whom I belong in that eschatological sense. But I'm also aware of the fact that this is a constant evolving journey, and that all of us have a moment in our life where we realize the more we learn, the more we realize the less we actually knew. And I think that's an important part of us when we come into our spiritual journey. Being born a son of the empire, as it was called back then, brought with us certain worldviews and privileges, along with constraints, blind spots, and bias. And I think it's important to understand where we're born into. So I was born into a home that was very affluent. I was the right color, I was the right gender, I was in a family that had a lot of reputation. We were one of those families, every community has them, you know who we're talking about, who everybody looks at as pillars of the community, you know, where what will people think is the mantra you raise with when you walk out the door. You're not just carrying yourself, you're carrying your family, your grandparents, yada, 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 yada. But we're also a home that was filled with pain and trauma, raised by functioning alcoholics, high-functioning addicts, people who did not have a language to process the pain that they were carrying, so they inflicted the damage on as many people as possible in the awesome name of the undoubtedly self-righteous. So you had those biases, I had those blind spots, and I realized from a very early age that these dances between what people were doing individually, what we were doing collectively, how our family interacted with each other. I was trying to make sense of it because I needed to make sense of who I was. I knew I was different from a very, very young age, probably 5 or 6. I wasn't able to place names to those differences until I got older and people named it for me. Homo, fag, sissy, poofta. But it wasn't just that made me different. I saw clearly as a result of not only my personality, my interests, my ways of being. I didn't like playing sports. Boys annoyed me, they hurt me, they bullied me, they teased me, so I didn't like being with them, which was also a catch-22 because that reinforced the idea that I was an other, that I was different because I wasn't like other boys. I grew up in a very gendered culture and very gendered society. After the age of 5, we did not interact with girls. They went to different schools, they played different games, they had different hobbies, different buses. We saw them once a year in a contained space. And yet, I always had this sense of being different, of being the other, of not being the default. This led to a sense of isolation, this belief in separateness, that I was somehow not worthy of being on the outside looking in, yet being told by everyone around me that I was the representation of the default, that I was the embodiment of privilege. So there was this dynamic, this tension, this dance within me that I thought God would resolve. I was seeking everything outside of myself. I realized very quickly that being told all these things meant that there are no universal truths. Despite what my parents told me, despite what my priests told me, despite what my government told me of this is the way, I also realized that there were many truths, multiple truths coexisting at the same time, this polarity that two people can experience the same event and take from it wildly different interpretations, memories, and impacts. This innate awareness of the human experience led me to understand how deeply the wisdom of my grandmother's teachings was, if you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always got. So if you want to get something different, you got to do something different. She also said, when you point one finger at somebody else, Bradley, remember there are 3 fingers pointing back at you. So when you hear yourself kvetching and complaining about other people, just pause for a second and see, what is it about you inside of you that you do not like them showing you? They are a mirror to you. They are not a barrier. I understood that the whole is truly made up of the sum of its parts, and the sum of its parts impact and influence the wholes in ways which people were not understanding. And this was one of the powerful lessons that came to us from the gay and rights lesbian movement that was birthed in the Stonewall riots in the United States and the Montreal riots in Canada. We realized that many of us, we had to fight for our rights. We had to fight to access them. We had to fight to keep them. We had to fight to be here, to be considered worthy. We had to push because no one in positions of power were willingly giving us access. When my mother had to reinvent her life at the age of 41 with a child as a single mother, she still could not get a credit card in her own name. She still could not get a business loan. She needed a man to sign off for her. Sometimes we have to fight for our right to partake, but also to partake, to be seen as equal and real and valid. But this need to fight rose up out of the ashes of the Second World War. The idea of human rights came from the horrors of the Holocaust and from the horrors that within a generation we had done what we had promised not to do. The First World War was meant to be the Great War, the war to end all wars, and yet it did not. And we were plunged into that fear and that terror in a way that shocked humanity with its capacity to wreak pain and suffering on each other. And so we came together collectively with the United Nations. We had the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We committed to do better. We committed to avoid conflict, and yet we did not. Decade after decade brought with us wars and violence and genocides and conflicts, while at the same time a commitment to human rights that we as a human, his family, have never seen before. The dance of polarities, multiple truths coexisting at the same time. And we now are living in a time where for many of us, we are now getting the opportunity to do what some of us have probably always asked of, like when we read books in history, like, well, what would I do if I was in that situation? What would I know what I would do? Well, now we're in that situation, and what are you doing? I know what I did. I pretended it wasn't happening. That's what I edited myself. I stopped wearing my Star of David. I avoided conversations with co-workers and colleagues and family members after having eggs thrown at our house on the first night of Hanukkah. I moved our menorah to the back. I didn't even tell my family about the eggs, by the way. I cleaned them off. I responded in fear because I was a child again, alone and terrified and overwhelmed and feeling like I was facing forces way beyond anything that I could deal with. But then I remembered the wisdom of my ancestors, and I remembered Stonewall, and I remembered all the things, and I took up space and place again. Pride reminds us that we can have both of these tensions existing at the same time, that it is a protest and a celebration. It is about resistance and resiliency. We have amazing capacities within us as human beings. We can do so much good. And yet we can also do so much harm. But in order to do better, in order not to be bitter, we have to work. I remember that saying, that does not what kills you makes you stronger, right? I was reminded of this morning, so I'm going to mention it. I was 14 years old, and there'd been a particularly hard time for me, and I had said that to my grandmother. It's like, well, that which doesn't kill us makes us stronger, and she said, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard in my life. And I'm like, what? She said, that which doesn't kill you makes you bitter. Bitter is our default. It takes work to be better. And most of us don't have the bandwidth to be better. And I had no idea what she was talking about. I was like, okay, well, that was a bit of a downer. But now I understand. She, like many women of her generation, did the best she could with what she had, but what she was presented as options were limited and very little. She also taught me that what you cannot heal, you have to carry. And I'll talk about that a little bit more because it's very important individually and collectively, because we are carrying a lot right now. Pride reminds us of that as well. Pride reminds us that when we come together in a community, we have to create space and places for different voices and different ways of being. There is no one way of being anything. There's no one way of being Jewish. There's no one way of being queer. There's no one way of being trans or cisgender or non-binary or anything. We have to allow space for the complexity of the human spirit to show up. We have diversity is our strength and inclusion is our security. There is natural diversity around us, thousands of types of butterflies, hundreds and hundreds of types of different fish. Diversity is the norm. It is the default. It is not homogeneity. It is not similarity. It is not sameness. It is understanding our role and our space and our place, but celebrating that when we allow space and place for all of us, inclusion is the security, because when you are seen and you are heard, when you have a sense of inclusion and belonging, you cannot be radicalized. You cannot fall to the myths of otherness and separateness. You cannot be overwhelmed by fear. Because when I reminded myself of those things, my courage came back. And I was able to move the menorah. And I was able to start talking about being a part of the Jewish community again in ways and spaces that I understood needed to be said. That's when I realized what my Nana was talking about. Some things cannot be healed, they can only be carried. And at the time, I thought it meant that there are just some hurts that are so big, that are so hard, that are so deeply ingrained to us that they cannot be healed. They can only be carried. And that is true. Healing takes a lot of work, and it is a dance of access to resources and support and wisdom and understanding, and not all of us have it. It also takes a willingness to forgive and to let go, and not all of us have it. Some of us love our victimhood. Some of us love or have not loved, have identified so strongly with what happened that it becomes a part of who we are. I know this because that was my journey for a very long time as a survivor of assault and trauma and all these different things. I didn't want to forgive because it was as if I was saying it was okay. That's what I thought. And then through some wisdom or some teachings here in this building, decades ago, with Rabbi Green, I realized that forgiveness is for me. It's for me and my relationship. It's not about them, it's about me, it's letting go. So then I understood that there's also a cost in carrying and there's a cost in healing. And we do that individually and collectively. We have people amongst us who cannot heal. They don't have that capacity. So we have to carry them. We have to work with them. We as a community have to create space and place for them to carry what they are carrying. We have to acknowledge that, and even if we've been able to heal it, we can't judge them because they have not. Right? We can't be like Aaron, right? Where he was like, oh, my bad, after he saw the punishment fall on someone else, right? We've got to be able to lean in and understand that what we do individually informs what happens collectively, and what happens collectively frames what is possible for us individually. So just as the Israelites had to understand these types of things as well, like when the cloud moved, they moved, and when the cloud stayed put, they stayed put. But they had a plan of what moving looked like. They had a process, they had resources, they knew what was going on, they had a big picture, but they also had individual actions. There was a whole journey here. And this shows us a creator, Hashem, God, he understood all of these things. They made allowances for it, even encouraged it and supported it in ways. So I'm asking us to recognize that dance that exists for all of us, between the energies of the individual and the collective, the push and pull of that human experience, and how are we making space and place for ourselves and for each other. What is your plan? What is your plan to heal? What is your plan to carry? How are we going to support each other as we do that? It's the acceptance of the fact that while we have a collective identity, that journey is also incredibly individual and unique. I am not the same now at 58 as I was at 18. I think that's probably the same for many of us in the room, right? Hopefully all of you can look back and say, I'm not the same person I was when I was a teenager. And even for those who are younger, I can remember when I was 21, I was a very different person than I was 15 and when I was 10. And yet, in many ways, I'm much more like I was when I was 8. I have a belief in the possibility of the world that I lost for a very long time. And so when that polarity and that tension kicks in, I remind myself that while I am the same, I am also different. I remind myself that I am the promise of my ancestors and that I carry them with me in my blood. I carry them with me in my practices and in my choices. I carry them with me even if they were not related to me by blood and bone, but by choice and by kinship. Pride is the tangible and intangible celebration that reminds us that it is both a feeling and a journey. It is a process and it is an outcome. It is taking up space that is both physical and intangible. It is the need for that space, if only for a few days a year, to have a visible representation of that internal relationship and journey. Just as the tent of presence was that visible representation for our ancestors, and the synagogue is the visible representation today for us in our communities, where we can come together sometimes only once a year and sometimes every day. But it is important and it is inherent, it is sacred and it is mundane. It is extraordinary and it is ordinary. These spaces and places are set apart, yet they are amongst us, and that is for a reason. They are there to remind us and to call us, because every day is a new day. Pride, like Judaism, calls us to be both collective and individual, to create action and spirit, to bind ourselves together, to honor the milestones but never rest on our laurels, to reflect on who it is we are and where it is we want to go and how it is we are going to get there and who do we bring along with us. So pride calls us to celebrate. It's a practice of acceptance. Acceptance without understanding. We don't always have to understand each other. We don't always have to agree with each other. But we do have to honor, understand, and appreciate and respect that person's path in terms of their individuality and their humanity. Pride calls us to understand that we can confront our failures and our falling downs. When Rabbi mentioned, I was here at a time when this wasn't welcoming. So I was called into the path of Judaism in my 40s. And so, of course, I was a social justice activist and all sorts of different things, and I was married to a man at that time. And so I started doing synagogue shopping, phoning up the synagogues and saying, hey, so this is the case. I was born Catholic, now I'm a bit of a pagan, I want to become a Jew, but I have a husband, and I don't want to be a second-class citizen. Where do I go? And every single synagogue was like, Temple Shalom. They're like, you would go to the Reforms. And so I went to the Reform with Rabbi Levinson, but I also knew Rabbi Green. They were two people who were very involved in the ecumenical movements. I knew of them through the Pride community. And when Rabbi Levinson left and I was sort of stranded, Rabbi Green reached out and said, come to us. Even though you're not going to be a conservative practice, come to us. And I was like, okay, and so I did. But it was also a weird thing, knowing that there were people here who loved me and celebrated me, but ritually could not accept me as equal. Who ritually said that my family was not going to be celebrated as much as other families. And then they went on this amazing journey, like so many other communities of faith, and they reached out to so many people. They did the work, they leaned in, and they learned from difficult conversations. And they became better. You all became better. And not only that, you became leaders. Because with much responsibility, with much power, with great power comes great responsibility, right? That saying. And it's important to understand that when we do things in a symbolic way, when we do things in a visible way, it's not just window dressing, it's not just beads and feathers. If it's backed up with intention and your community, your congregation, Sharazedic has walked your talk, you always have. And so I just want to thank you all for this beautiful full circle moment where, I've felt at home here for many, many years. And I just want to thank you that, because while pride and things remind us that we have to be able to have resilience, we also have to rest and renew, because none of us can pour from an empty cup. Thank you.